This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 14, continuing the micro theme of change of government. How do you actually execute a change of government operation, or a regime change operation? A lot of it actually is creating the social conditions, and that's more about protest and parallel government, and demanding change of government. But at some point, you gotta do the thing. It's referred to as a hot swap in computer networking, where you remove one component and replace it while other systems are still online, and you want to minimize downtime, and they time it with like a stopwatch. They time it so people are only losing milliseconds of service. But yeah, you'll see that this gets into one of my favorite parts, the regime change, because there's a lot of engineering in it. And while I myself am not so technically savvy, I'm interested in becoming that way, and I'm educating myself. And I come from a family background that is. But anyway, I just want to dive into it. This is mostly, I think, going to focus on Curzio Malaparte's 1931 book on the technique of revolutionary coup d'états, which I heard about through Slavoj Žižek. It's on YouTube. It's about Trotsky versus Lenin. That's the name of the YouTube video. About their differing ideas of insurrection and how they both sort of took over part of the insurrection. And I would say both were necessary. Lenin led the political part and Trotsky led the technical part. So, I read a book called Swarmwise, which is about scaling up quickly when you build an organization from zero to a mass party. It was for the Pirate Party in Sweden. And it seems that the hackers in Sweden already enjoyed some informal control of society, because when police raided Pirate Bay, the online community shut down police servers, and the site Pirate Bay was able to get back online before the police were. As always, the preference is never to have to organize or implement the direct change of government ourselves, but to inspire the pillars of state to do it for us. Now, unfortunately, Curzio Malaparte's book on the topic costs $500 to $600, but there is a free PDF. Malaparte says, Trotsky said that the communists did not know how to benefit by the lesson of October 1917, which was not a lesson in revolutionary strategy, but in the tactics of an insurrection. I will try to get the page number to that later. So, Žižek in the video mentions that there are 8 to 10 technical nerve centers which Trotsky focused on, including rail, post, phone, electricity, water, and food supplies. In this model, Trotsky supposedly claimed to need less than 1,000 people organized in groups of 20 with lots of technicians. In the prior weeks before the October insurrection, the Bolsheviks were scouting each location, casing the joint, to prepare the technical details of taking them over. The name of the book is The Technique of Revolution by Curzio Malaparte. You can also get an older version of Edward Luttwak's Coup D'état, A Practical Handbook, online. So if this all sounds a little too voluntaristic, or engaging in an advanced tactic before the general political situation for it is prepared, Lenin addressed this accusation directly by refusing a comparison between Trotsky and the French voluntarist revolutionary coup maker Auguste Blanqui, who would launch insurrection attempts with small handfuls of people in non-revolutionary situations. In his letter of October 17, Lenin defended Trotsky's tactics. Trotsky is not playing with the ideas of Blanqui, he said. A military conspiracy is a game of that sort only if it is not organized by the political party of a definite class of people, and if the organizers disregard the general political situation, and the international situation in particular. There's a great difference between a military conspiracy, which is deplorable from every point of view, and the art of armed insurrection. Trotsky said, insurrection is not an art, it is an engine. Technical experts are required to start it, and they alone could stop it. This is some of the history from The Technique of Revolution by Curzio Malaparte. Among the crowd of deserters that thronged in the streets, in the midst of the chaos that reigned in the government buildings and offices, in the general headquarters, in the post offices, telephone and telegraph exchanges, in the stations, barracks, and the head offices of the city's technical services, they practiced insurrectional tactics, unarmed and in broad daylight, and their little groups of 3 or 4 men passed unnoticed. So Russian society is practically collapsing, and there's general dysfunction and disorder. And in that situation, the Bolsheviks were literally able to rehearse the power grab, and no one even really knew what it was, because the situation was so delicate that it only took a few people to push it over. So such insurrections are possible not only during general strikes, but during any era of chaos and disintegration, which is certainly a description of the modern West. When challenged by Lenin on the lack of a general strike, I have disorganization on my side, Trotsky answered, and that is better than a general strike. Society is disorganized. So casing the joint. Trotsky's Red Guards had been rehearsing in the very center of the town during the past 10 days. Antonov Ovsienko it was who organized these tactical exercises. this sort of dress rehearsal of the coup d'etat in broad daylight, wherever the streets were thronging with movement and round buildings which were of the greatest strategic importance in the governmental and political strongholds. The police and military authorities were so obsessed by the idea of a sudden revolt by the proletarian masses, and so concerned with meeting the danger, that they failed to notice Antonov Ovsienko's gangs at work. Amid such widespread disorder, who should notice the little groups of unarmed workers, the soldiers and the sailors who wandered about in the corridors of the telephone and telegraph exchanges, in the central post office, in the government offices and general headquarters, taking note of the arrangement of the offices and seeing how the telephones and lights were fitted? They visualized and remembered the plan of these buildings and studied the means of getting into them suddenly and at a moment's notice. They reckoned with their chances of success, estimating the opposition and looking for the places of least resistance, the weakest and most vulnerable places in the defensive organization of the technical, military, and secretarial services of the state. In the general confusion, who should notice some 3 or 4 sailors, a couple of soldiers, or a stray workman wandering round some buildings, going in and climbing the stairs, people who did not even look at each other when they met. No one even suspected these people of obeying precise and detailed orders, of carrying out a plan, or of underground exercises directed against the strategic points in the state's defense. Later, the Red Guards would strike effectively because they had conducted their invisible maneuvers on the very ground where the battle would shortly begin. Kind of like on January 6th, when the rioters had been given tours of the Capitol building in the days leading up. So, a coup is about seizing urban life support systems. Trotsky succeeded? Is this my notes? No, this is more from Curzio Malaparte. Trotsky succeeded in getting hold of the plan of the town's technical services. Dybenko's sailors, aided by 2 engineers and engine room artificers, mastered the underground gas and water piping, the electric power cables, and the telephone and telegraph system. 2 of them explored the drains under the headquarters of the general staff. The isolation of a whole district or even a mere group of houses had to be made practicable within a few minutes, so Trotsky divided the town into sections, determined which were the strategic points, and allotted the work, section by section, to gangs of soldiers and skilled workers. I need to stop for a minute and just reread that for myself. That's so amazing. Okay, moving along. Technical experts were necessary as well as soldiers. The capture of the railway station in Moscow was allotted to 2 squads consisting of 25 Latvian soldiers, 2 sailors, and 10 railwaymen. 3 gangs of sailors, workmen, and railway officials, 160 men in all, were ordered to take over the station in Warsaw. For the capture of other stations, Dybenko assigned a number of squads of 20 men each. A telegraphist attached to every squad controlled movements on the railway lines. On October 21st, acting under orders from Antonov Ovsienko, I think his background will be explained later. I think he was a Bolshevik chess player who had military experience. On October 21, acting under orders from Antonov Ovsienko, who was in close touch with the maneuvers, all the gangs rehearsed the capture of the railway stations, and the general rehearsal was perfectly well ordered and precise in every detail. On that day, 3 sailors went to the main electricity plant near the port. The plant, run by the city's technical services, was not even guarded. The manager asked the sailors whether they were the men whom he had asked the commander of the square to send him. He had been wanting a guard for the last 5 days. So the people who were preparing to take over the plant get accosted by some official who's saying, "Are you the security who's been sent here to take over? Where have you guys been?" Oh, this is so silly. The 3 sailors took over the defense of the electric plant in case of insurrection, they said. So they play along with it. In the same way, a few gangs of engine room artificers took over the other 3 municipal plants. In order to overthrow the modern state, he said, and I think he is probably Trotsky, you need a storming party, technical experts, and gangs of armed men led by engineers. Oh my gosh. On the eve of the coup d'etat, Trotsky told Dzerzhinsky that Kerensky's government must be completely ignored by the Red Guards, that the chief thing was to capture the state and not to fight the government with machine guns, that the Republican Council, the ministries, and the Duma played an unimportant part in the tactics of insurrection and should not be the objectives of an armed rebellion, that the key to the state lay not in its political and secretarial organizations, nor yet in the Tauride Maria or Winter Palaces. but in its technical services, such as the electric stations, the telephone and telegraph offices, the port, gasworks, and water mains. All right, I'm gonna just comment for a minute. I don't agree with this concept of Trotsky, but I half agree with it. I think Lenin is the other half. Lenin was the one who was focused on storming the Winter Palace, storming these national, central, symbolic legislature buildings, seeing it as a sort of chess game where the king on each side of the chessboard is the central legislature building of each side. I think that's true. Lenin's concept is true, but Trotsky's concept is also true in a sense. It doesn't matter who's meeting in some fancy building if someone's got control of the infrastructure. The truth is they both matter. Lenin and Trotsky sort of formed a hand in a glove with this. I think they both complemented each other. But I just find Trotsky's concept of like technical power rather than political power as the real determining power to be like, oh man, some kind of mad genius. Like he's like a mad scientist of revolution. Anyway, so as another aside, this is not Malaparte, this is my notes. This explains why January 6th failed so terribly for being a head-on assault on the main government building as the main strategy of the insurrection. In Russia 1917, it was only after the urban life support systems had been seized that the main siege of the government, the storming of the Winter Palace by large crowds, was carried out. Of course, it's important to remember that such a smooth operation was only possible in a revolutionary situation, where so many people sympathized with the revolution that an organizer like Trotsky could choose the best people for the job, who were willing to carry out surgical strikes and possess technical qualifications. Arguably, the general revolutionary movement made the conditions possible for Trotsky's surgical operation. Back to the Malaparte. A general strike is unnecessary, Trotsky replied. Chaos in Petrograd is more useful for our purpose than a general strike. The government cannot cope with an insurrection when a general disorganization paralyzes the state. Since we cannot rely on the strike, we will rely on the chaos. The plan of operations had been drawn up by a former officer of the Imperial Army, Antonov Ovsienko, who was also known as a mathematician, a chess player, a revolutionary, and an exile. Lenin, referring to Trotsky's tactics, once said of Antonov Ovsienko that only a chess player like him could organize the insurrection. The insufficiency of police measures was evidenced by those tactics of defense called, quote, service of order and protection, end quote, which may give good results when directed against a crowd in revolt, but not against a handful of determined fighters. Police measures are useless in the face of a surprise attack. Okay, more Malaparte. The situation was paradoxical. Never before had an insurrection claimed to have captured the state without even attacking the government. It looked as though the Bolsheviks did not care about the government. Why were the government offices not taken over? Could one master the state and govern Russia without even controlling the state's administration? The Bolsheviks had, of course, captured all the public services, but Kerensky had not resigned. He was still the head of the government, even if for the present, the public services, the railways, the electric plants, telephone, telegraph, and post offices, the state bank, and the coal, petroleum, and green depots were not under his control. If in actual fact, the ministers in the Winter Palace were unable to govern, government offices were not working, the government had been cut off from the rest of Russia, and every means of communication was in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Maybe this is a typo. I just need to edit that later. Remember, this is a writing process. This is a book I'm working on writing. I'm quoting this at length for a book I'm working on writing. Quoting someone else's book. Curzio Malaparte is The Technique of Revolution, 1931. So anyway, government offices were not working. The government had been cut off from the rest of Russia by every means of communication. And every means of communication was in the hands of the Bolsheviks. All the roads in the suburbs were barricaded. No one might leave the town. General headquarters were cut off. The Bolsheviks had taken over their main wireless telegraphy station. Red Guards were quartered in the fortress of Peter and Paul, and a number of regiments belonging to the garrison of Petrograd were already acting under orders from the Revolutionary Military Committee. Aside, what Gene Sharp calls bouncing on the heads of society, where the ruler is not yet deposed but can't find anyone who can or will follow their orders, is exactly what was going on with Kerensky during the October insurrection. I just find all this to be electrifying. Maybe you find it boring. I find this stuff to be like more interesting than anything I hear being talked about anywhere in politics, personally. So the next day, on October 25th, during the opening of the Second Pan-Russian Soviet Congress in the Smolny Institute, Trotsky ordered Antonov Ovsienko to attack the Winter Palace, where Kerensky's ministers had taken refuge. Quote, these shock troops should be recruited from among specialized workmen, mechanics, electricians, telegraph and radio operators acting under orders of technical engineers who understand the technical workings of the state. End quote. I don't believe I ever clarified, so I should clarify now that in Curzio Malaparte's Technique of Revolution, he discusses many different revolutionary coup d'états, focuses a lot on the October insurrection in 1917, but also another insurrection attempted by Trotsky in 1927. On the 10th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky led another coup d'état attempting to overthrow Stalin. So that's very interesting. And I've been talking about the 1917 successful coup so far, and now this next part is about the 10-year anniversary, 1927, unsuccessful coup by Trotsky to stop Stalinism. Trotsky's methods were so successful that to prevent an anti-Stalinist coup by Trotsky, Stalin utilized Trotsky's same methods, except utilized by Stalin to defend his already established control of the state, as opposed to offensively, like during October 1917. Quote, Malaparte. Trotsky returned to Moscow pale and feverish to organize the shock troops for the overthrow of Stalin and for the capture of the state. Stalin, however, knew how to turn the lesson of October 1917 to good account. With the help of Meninsky, the new chief of the GPU. Let me just look up what GPU means for you, if you don't know. GPU Russia. State Political Directorate as an intelligence service and secret police. So the secret police. Stalin's secret police. Stalin, however, knew how to turn the lesson of October 1917 to good account. With the help of Meninsky, the new chief of the GPU, he organized a special corps for the defense of the state. The headquarters of this special corps were in the Lubyanka Palace, the home of the GPU. Meninsky personally supervised the choice of his communist recruits from the workers in the state's public services among railwaymen, mechanics, electricians, and telegraphists. Their only weapons were hand grenades and revolvers so that they might move about quickly. The special corps consisted of 100 squads of 10 men each, reinforced by 20 armored cars. Each detachment was provided with a half company of machine gunners. Communications between the various squads and the Lubyanka headquarters were kept open by dispatch riders. Meninsky took complete charge of the whole organization and divided Moscow into 10 sections. A network of secret telephone lines connected up the sectors with each other and with the Lubyanka Palace. Apart from Meninsky, it was only the men who had laid the secret wires who knew of their existence. Thus, all the vital centers in the technical organization of Moscow were telephonically connected with the Lubyanka. At strategic points in each sector, some houses were occupied by a number of cells or centers of observation for control and resistance, and these provided links in the chain of the whole system. They underwent both technical, military, and political instruction. They were bred to hatred of their adversaries, known and unknown, whether Jews or followers of Trotsky. No Jews could belong to the organization. Stalin's hatred of 3 Jews, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, did not of itself justify the reappearance, 10 years after the revolution of October 1917, of a national anti-Semitism reminiscent of the days of Stolypin, who was an old Tsarist figure. Nor can the origin of Stalin's struggle against the Jews be reasonably attributed to religious fanaticism or traditional prejudice, but rather to the struggle which had to be waged against Trotsky's dangerous Confederates. Meninsky had said that nearly all of the chief supporters of Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were Israelites, and indeed all the Jews in the Red Army, the trade unions, and factories were on Trotsky's side. In the Moscow Soviet, where Kamenev enjoyed a majority, and in the Leningrad Soviet, which was the heart and soul for Zinoviev, the pith of the opposition to Stalin was Jewish. All that was required in order to draw the army, trade unions, and working class masses in Moscow and Leningrad away from Trotsky, from Zinoviev and Zinoviev, was to kindle all the old anti-Semitic prejudices and instinctive hatred of the Russian people for the Jews. In his struggle against the permanent revolution, Stalin relied on the common selfishness of the kulaks and on the ignorance of the peasant masses, neither of whom had relinquished any of their age-long hatred of the Jews. Now, this is Curzio Malaparte's claim. I'm including it in the book, but I have to admit I haven't really done deep research into this. I think it's worth being repeated, but if people want to get into the historicity of this, like, was this really true? Like, did Stalin opportunistically exploit anti-Semitism to this extent? Is a question that I am not prepared to answer in terms of whether that was true or not historically. I'm certainly not for Stalin. I'm very for Trotsky, but I could not tell you. I don't have the sources on this. I say this as like a former history major. That's why I clarify this, because I think we should clarify to people, like, what support do we have for making a claim? And for me, this is just something interesting to include that I would invite people to research further on their own. So back to the Malaparte. By kindling this anti-Semitism, Stalin was able to form a united front of soldiers, workers, and peasants against the dangers of Trotskyism. So back to my notes. An aside, the main point of mentioning the above anti-Semitism of Stalin is not to accuse Stalin of being an anti-Semite, but of being a politician who opportunistically exploited anti-Semitism in order to shut down a democratic challenge to his own regime. In fact, the real point is simply to indicate that defending against insurrection is as much a political task as a technical one, involving organizing your own faction according to strategic power blocks, whether political, ethnic, or both, and not solely the engineering. This is equally as true of the original October insurrection, where Trotsky's technical orientation was critical but also relied on the Bolshevik strategic power base in the working class. Okay, we're back to the book by Curzio Malaparte, The Technique of Revolution. When Trotsky attempted his second revolution in 1927, Meninsky took precautions. His defensive tactics lay, not in the protection of threatened buildings, by a great display of troops, but rather in their defense with a mere handful of men stationed inside the walls. He parried Trotsky's invisible attack by an invisible defense. This is like high-precision warfare, people. Trotsky had not foreseen Meninsky's tactics. Let me stop. It's almost more like an intelligence operation at this point than a military operation. These small-scale, it's like playing Black Ops, Call of Duty Black Ops, baby. Anyway, Black Ops 2, you know why. You know the global revolution against capitalism that happens at the end of Black Ops 2. You love it. You know how they hoist the red flag over the Reichstag at the end of Call of Duty. You love it. You love it. Anyway, back to the Malaparte. Trotsky had not foreseen Meninsky's tactics, and it was already too late when he discovered that his adversaries had learned their lessons in October 1917. When told that his sudden attacks on telegraph, telephone, and railway stations were a failure and that things unexpected and unexplained were happening, he at once realized that his insurrection had met with an organized defense far more complicated than mere police measures. But as yet, he was unaware of the real situation. When news of the failure to seize the main electric power station finally reached him, he suddenly changed his mind and decided to seize the political and administrative organization of the state. Seeing that his shock troops had been routed and scattered in every direction by their opponent's sudden and violent attack, he abandoned his tactics and concentrated all his efforts on a supreme attempt at popular insurrection. For being poorly prepared, this popular insurrection failed. It could be argued that, as much as January 6 was a coup attempt, the Secret Service practically launched their own counter-coup against Trump by refusing to let him march on the Capitol, instead returning him to the White House. Not that I think they did a single thing wrong. Anyway, Malaparte, we're back to it. In Italy, Mussolini had used a similar method of technical seizure of power in addition to a political seizure of power, except that his teams of technicians were composed of people who had slowly been won to the notion of fascism by prior years of political struggle, formally similar if politically opposite of the Bolshevik technician storm units, who were a small specialized group but who were based on and drawn from the socialist masses created out of years of political struggle and persuasion. In a debate over this topic with Lenin, Trotsky contended, quote, "The whole populace is too cumbersome for an insurrection. There need only be a small company, cold-blooded and violent, well-trained in the tactics of insurrection," end quote. Trotsky demanded what he called, quote, "shock troops." Lenin referred to them as storming parties. During his debates with Trotsky on this topic, Lenin said, "We must recruit the most tenacious among our storming parties for detachments whose duty it will be to occupy all the important bridges and to take part in every decisive engagement. We must also form gangs of workers armed with rifles and hand grenades who will march on enemy positions, on the officers' training schools, and on the telephone and telegraph exchanges and surround them. The triumph of both the Russian and the world revolution depends on a 2 or 3 days struggle." "That is all quite reasonable," said Trotsky, "but it is too complicated. The plan is too vast and it is a strategy which includes too much territory and too many people. It is not an insurrection any longer, it is a war. In order to take possession of Petrograd, it is needless to take the train in Finland. Those who start from too great a distance often have to stop halfway. An offensive of 20,000 men from Revel or Kronstadt for the purpose of seizing the Alexandra Theater is rather more than is required. It is more than an assault. As far as strategy is concerned, Marx himself could be outdone by Kornilov." Oh man, brutal. One must concentrate on tactics, move in a small space with few men, concentrate all efforts on principal objectives, strike hard and straight. I don't think it is so complicated. Dangerous things are always extremely simple. In order to be successful, one must not challenge an unfavorable circumstance nor trust to a favorable one. Hit your adversary in the stomach and the blow will be noiseless. Insurrection is a piece of noiseless machinery. Your strategy demands too many favorable circumstances. Insurrection needs nothing. It is self-sufficient. End quote. So, my aside is that Malaparte argues that the real reason European socialist revolutions have failed is not any political reason, but because they do not focus on the techniques of regime change with the same focus as did Trotsky. Quote, whoever is able to take an unprejudiced view of events in Europe in 1919 and 1920 cannot help wondering how Europe managed to get over such a serious revolutionary crisis. In almost all countries, the liberal middle classes were incapable of defending the state. Its defensive methods lay and still lie in a simple application of those police systems which, from all time and even now, are relied upon by both absolute and liberal governments. That is, monarchist versus democratic governments. But if the bourgeoisie was unable to defend the state, it was compensated by the inadequacy of the revolutionary parties. They could not meet the old-fashioned defensive methods of government with modern offensive tactics. They could not parry police measures with a revolutionary technique. It is significant that the Catalans, hold up, I need to look up what Catalans are. I'm not just going to gloss over that. Okay, the aside is that Catiline was a Roman politician and soldier, best known for instigating the Catilinarian conspiracy, a failed attempt to violently seize control of the Roman state in 63 BC. So the coup plotters, the insurrection plotters, those are the Catalans. All right. It is significant that the Catalans, both of the right and of the left, were unable, at the most critical stage in Europe's revolutionary crisis in 1919 and 1920, to use the experience of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were ignorant of the method, the tactics, and modern technique of the Coup d'Etat, of which Trotsky had given a new and classic example. Their idea of capturing the state was out of date, and so they were doomed to find themselves on the adversary's ground, and using means and methods which all governments, however weak and short-sighted, can successfully counteract by the traditional means and methods of state defense. Europe was ripe for revolution, but the revolutionary parties were clearly unable to make good use of these favorable circumstances or of Trotsky's experience. They held that the success of the Bolshevik insurrection in October 1917 was due to the peculiar condition of Russia in those days and to Kerensky's blunders. But at that time, almost every European nation had a Kerensky at the head of the government. They forgot that when Trotsky formed his plan for a coup d'etat and put it into execution, he took not the slightest notice of Russia's special situation. The novelty in Trotsky's insurrectional tactics lay in this complete disregard for the general situation of the country. Kerensky's blunders could influence only the plan and execution of the Bolshevik coup d'etat. Trotsky's tactics would have been the same even if the Russian situation had been different. End quote. Okay. Note that the chapters on coups and combat will be the most violent chapters of this book. I can already feel the disappointment of my Quaker friends, like a burning sensation in my skin. If you are looking for pure nonviolence, these are the chapters in which you will be least interested, and you can skip the combat chapter and only skim this change of government chapter for some of its political arguments about how even Gene Sharp-style color revolutions and crowd revolutions do tend to include some type of miniature coup, even if it results in no casualties and is carried out by the state pillars internally rather than the protesters. Yeah, the Quakers are probably not going to like these particular episodes. It's an uncomfortable reality. So Palantir Artificial Intelligence Platform is a system being marketed to the defense sector, which allows for military command decisions to be made automatically, but within a set of legal and ethical guidelines. Maybe we need to code an AI to plan the takeover of infrastructural systems, physically rather than digitally, during a change of government, but I suspect that Palantir probably wouldn't license to us for that purpose after all. What am I talking about here? Oh, okay. This is my notes, not Curzio Malaparte anymore. In the United States, the revolution in Washington, D.C. will have to take the form of a classic popular revolution, crowd revolution, or color revolution. Coup d'Etat, a practical handbook, details the extensive coup-proofing existing in Washington, D.C., specifically with multiple units of state security forces from different branches, all standing by to block a coup attempt by any one of them, to block each other in effect. Similar to how some paranoid dictatorships have multiple secret police who surveil each other. This means the revolution in DC will have to take a highly political and civil rather than tactical or military form. Concretely, this entails the presence of a peacefully formed parallel government, demanding the removal of U.S. Congress, a sustained campaign of leftovist and/or serious street actions building support for the parallel government and delegitimizing Congress, large-scale protests at some point in support of the parallel government, and generalized disruption brought about by ongoing protest, labor strikes, and civil disobedience escalating to obstructing streets with barricades and encampments, as in the Ukraine 2014 protests. In practice, such action in D.C. would only work if similar events were happening in other cities, in the manner of the nationwide many-city protests of Occupy Wall Street and the George Floyd protests. Only in this situation of a challenge by a parallel government, combined with nationwide civil disruption, would the final change of government be possible. It could take multiple forms. The first ideal scenario would be if Congress finally had the decency to meet the demands of the masses by collectively resigning from office, disbanding its own existence, and passing a final outgoing resolution recognizing the legitimacy of the parallel government as the rightful transitional government. Let's not, however, hold our breath that the congressional puppets of the super wealthy will ever possess such decency. The second possibility would be flipping the pillars into active participation in a change of government, with sections of the security forces carrying out an Oliver Cromwell-style coup in which they enter and disband Congress on behalf of the protesters and their parallel government. Again, this would only be possible with enough widespread rebellion to demotivate other security forces from obstructing such action. The third possibility is a combination of flipping the pillars with crowd revolution in the style of the Russian Revolution, in which a combination of workers and soldiers in mutiny storm the main building together. The fourth possibility, probably the most likely in the Western world, is the Ukrainian 2014 option, in which security forces simply abandon their posts and allow protesters to take control of main buildings, similar to the third option, which combines flipping the pillars with popular action, but in this instance, the pillars playing a passive rather than active role. January 6 was in many ways the counter-revolutionary version of this. Finally, if and only if a situation of parallel government plus nationwide civil disruption exists, any of the above approaches could be preceded by or supplemented with a Trotsky-style infrastructural takeover, but this is only possible if the general rebellion is widespread enough that you could gather the proper skilled workers on your side to do such a thing with minimal obstruction by security forces, who would likely be preoccupied by having to contain protests elsewhere throughout the cities. At some point, no revolution really makes sense without protesters, revolutionaries, or sympathetic state security forces occupying government buildings. For all of Curzio Malaparte's enthusiasm for Trotsky's technical and infrastructural aspects of a coup d'état, it all still would have remained without culmination, if not for Lenin's general insistence on seizing the Winter Palace and arresting the Russian provisional government. We will all have to get over our January 6 heebie-jeebies, because something like a January 6 with opposite politics will have to occur at some point, even if it occurs in a much less violent manner. One of the main differences is that a democratic socialist occupation of central government buildings would have to occur at the self-initiative of the masses organized around a parallel government and not around some ridiculous false claim of a stolen election, not led by some main party presidential figure. This would give a democratic socialist occupation of central government buildings more popular legitimacy, as something arising genuinely from the people and from outside the system, unlike January 6, which claimed to be upholding a stolen election, and occurred from inside the system, centered around Donald Trump, who is one of the system's main figureheads, still quite popular among certain sections of the ruling class, if unpopular among others. Revolutionaries should not expect the revolution to be led by any elected figure within the ruling government. More likely, it would be led by people in the parallel government. Therefore, a democratic socialist occupation of central government buildings would be more comparable to the Ukraine 2014 Revolution of Dignity than to January 6, which was more properly a coup for its internal sabotage of capital defenses at a ruling figure's behest, rather than as a breakdown of discipline among security forces in the face of popular action. Woo! Alright, as much as establishment liberals were correct to condemn January 6 as the fascist coup attempt it was, we will have to get over our aversion to words like sedition and insurrection, realizing that these very things are not always evil fascism, but sometimes a rightful democratic, ethical, and patriotic duty, that sometimes even civil disobedience amounts to sedition and insurrection, and that the American Revolution itself was certainly a seditious insurrection. The long jail sentences faced by January 6 rioters may likewise be a risk that is the duty of democratic socialists to face, for comparable if not identical actions, if with totally opposite politics from January 6. These long sentences may be appropriate against reactionaries who participated in a fascist coup, but this is not some kind of evidence that all seditious insurrection is morally equivalent to January 6th, which the establishment liberals like MSNBC's Ari Melber seem to continually imply with their endless propagandistic repetition of the words sedition and insurrection in the most negative possible tone. It's almost like the liberal media is intentionally pushing back on the insurrectionism developing within the anti-capitalist movement and even among grassroots liberals who participated in George Floyd. People who carry out a coup for Trump are fascist collaborators who deserve to be repressed. If democratic socialists attempted to occupy and disband United States Congress in the name of installing a democratic socialist government, they would be heroes, and any long jail sentences they faced would be wrongful martyrdom deserving our jail support and our opposition to get the sentences reduced or canceled. Sometimes cancel culture, when you're canceling the sentences of revolutionaries, that's good cancel culture. Okay, so a coup d'etat is an engineering project, the ultimate hot swap of removing one component. You know what? Let's change this. Not just coup d'etat. A change of government is an engineering project, the ultimate hot swap of removing one component and installing another to an integrated system, while the overall system is still running, with all the specifics of managing each infrastructure connected to the system during the transition, and extensive prior preparation to minimize how long each component goes down, hopefully to mere moments of outage, if any. Technology professionals who engage in these type of maintenance operations measure time in terms of seconds and milliseconds. Coups are legal in Thailand, where the king will frequently recognize the resulting government of a coup, and the military is legally allowed to take power during civil unrest. Imagine coup d'etats being built right into your constitution. It's the most honest constitution on the planet. The Ukraine scenario of law enforcement simply withdrawing is highly unlikely if the approach of the movement is to be anti-cop, and more likely if the movement's focus is on economics and its messaging to law enforcement is persuasive subversion rather than denunciation. You can try to fit in with the cool kids and act like a leftist, or you can engage in strategic conflict capable of systemic change that meets the people's material needs. The corporate media elevates spectacles of violence on purpose to encourage that behavior and prevent the real subversion from occurring. Protest has to be used less as an opportunity for fighting the police and more as an opportunity to infect them with our ideology, or we will usually be crushed by their vastly superior equipment and military support. Preferably, a democratic socialist revolution would be more like the Ukrainian model of crowd protest plus police withdrawal rather than requiring all the cloak and dagger infrastructural takeovers practiced by Trotsky in the October Revolution in Russia. It's still good to be prepared, and to therefore study urban infrastructure, but the advantage of the people will always be moral rather than technical. In modern settings, arresting politicians could legally be considered a form of kidnapping, so it's preferable to achieve the Ukrainian model of the police standing aside, at which point the old legislature usually flees, evacuates, and disperses on its own prompting, rather than the Russian model of recruiting a mutinous military to join in an offensive which arrests the former legislature. This has the disadvantage of letting the old politicians retreat and possibly reorganize, but the advantage of letting you firmly establish the parallel government as the new political authority and as the new ruling government before attempting anything as legally risky as apprehending the old politicians. If the former politicians are demoralized enough at this point to give up on reconvening as a government, that saves us a ton of trouble. Rather than the technical preparations and logistics of a change of government being an afterthought in socialist theory and strategy, these topics should be the main overriding central focus, with all other concerns being secondary. The fact that this is not the current ranking of priorities in the socialist movement is the precise reason socialism has not yet been victorious. Without this, we have no sense of the concrete goal we are marching toward, and end up marching in circles. Correcting this should be the main conversation and the main debate in the socialist movement. Again, concrete preparations for regime change include forming a parallel government, holding demonstrations demanding the removal of the current government and the installation of the parallel government, training and educating socialists in the theory and purpose and necessity of the previous items on the list, aesthetic details of demonstrations like color coordination and slogans, tactical details of demonstrations such as barricade construction materials, intense detailed study of the many multiple infrastructure systems of major cities, not for the purpose of damaging them, but of occupying control of them, and possibly drilling and preparing for room-to-room fighting with equipment including small arms, light armor, flashbang grenades or firecrackers and fireworks as substitutes, and entry tools such as crowbars or sledgehammers, all of which we hope to avoid, though it's best to be prepared and end up not needing it. This gives psychological resilience during tense moments. I'm going to add wooden sticks to the list of entry tools. Today we would add cellular and internet to the list of infrastructure focused on by Trotsky during the October insurrection. Okay. While it's just a dramatization, in Sergei Eisenstein's Soviet film October, the phrase used by the Russians storming the Winter Palace to the old government was, quote, "You are all under arrest," end quote. You can also declare a government deposed. Deposed is a more tactful word than overthrown. I declare this government deposed. Anyway, the real crime of the Trump supporters on January 6th was not that they committed sedition, but that they committed sedition for the wrong reasons. A coup can be a psychological operation, insofar as one common technique is to tell security forces that their commanding officers and superiors are already on board, when in fact they may not be. Freezing movements of persons and communications, airports, personnel, roads blocked, TV and internet cut, maneuvers after the freeze, and a televised address are typical features of a modern coup d'etat. The miniature revolutionary army which stormed the Winter Palace in the October Revolution was made partially out of defected units of the old government's military and partially out of units formed from workers in specific workplaces. Institutions are essentially machines made of people, so all politics is a subcategory of engineering. Social engineering is mostly psychology. A coup is a top-down military revolt planned by a conspiracy of high-ranking officers, whereas revolutions involve bottom-up military revolt that's planned and more spontaneous, in which crowd protests influence low-ranking soldiers to disobey their officers and join the revolution in whole units. However, at decisive moments, sometimes a conspiracy of top officers can help carry out a change of government after mass defections have already occurred in the lower ranks. Any popular takeover of a building would be best assisted by people who are comfortable with being shoved and jostled in a crowd setting, including metalheads, punks, and sports fans. In seizing the modern means of production, it would certainly help to have corporate IT departments, system administrators, and network departments or administrators on board. In a situation of political disintegration, just a small number of fighters can take power, with the October insurrection of the Russian Revolution involving only 40,000 troops. This is in contrast to the 120,000 attendees of the January 6th rally, 3 times as many people as the October insurrection, and they still failed. What the Russian Revolution really did was combine flipping the pillars with physical struggle. It flipped part of the pillars, the military and revolt, and used it against the rest of the pillars, the remaining loyalists in the military, to the provisional government. This is a surgical operation as opposed to large-scale conventional warfare. There is another path, that of disintegration of the police forces through unarmed fighting, such as the pushing and shoving of rioting, but the George Floyd protests proved that not only do the security forces tend to quickly reassert and rebuild themselves, but also that the absence of an alternative legislature leaves a power vacuum which the capitalist government quickly reoccupies, even if it is temporarily driven into retreat. So the Bolsheviks stockpiled enough arms to arm its miniature army of 40,000 people during the October insurrection. This was accomplished through workers bringing their personal firearms, as well as funded through crimes such as bank robberies, large donations from wealthy sympathizers, and membership dues. This is a totally different project than organizations which pour the main of their resources into reform struggles. The nonviolent version of this would be paying organizers to build demonstrations directly demanding a change of government or rallies for a parallel government. Again, these actions would be frustratingly small at first, similar to Stalin's organizing of a demonstration for socialism itself, rather than any reform demand during his early activism, parenthesis, an admirable example despite Stalin's later anti-democratic politics, end parenthesis. Similarly, the basic infrastructure of educational literature and meetings for building an alternative legislature, and to even establish the theory behind why it makes sense, will need financial support. This goes beyond ordinary fundraising. Even building a simple, non-violent pro-democracy color revolution takes significant financial support from either wealthy donors, Western governments, or both. Okay, people, we got through it. That is all I've got on the topic of change of government. This has been episode 14 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. Signing off.